history of William Shakespeare's hometown of Stratford Upon Avon is vast, and you would have to spend a significant amount of time there to study it all. And many people can and do spend their entire lives studying the history of just this one town. But today, we're going to look at one specific aspect of William Shakespeare's life in Stratford upon Avon, and that is his religious practice. By asking the question, did Shakespeare go to church? You may know that William Shakespeare is buried at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford upon Avon, but what you may not know is that this was Shakespeare's home church. He actually attended there every week, and his family is also buried there beside him. Now, what's interesting about the history of Holy Trinity Church is that you can't really tell from the fact that Shakespeare attended this church what his personal leanings were about religion, because attending church was actually required by the crown. And when you study the history of Holy Trinity Church and you take a look at all of the different processes it has gone through over the literal centuries, close to, I think, over 1,000 years. It was founded in the 700s. So that would make it over, what even is that? It's going on 2,000 years old, this church. In the 1700s, it would be, so when Shakespeare was going to church there, it was almost 1,000 years old. So it's very old, and it's gone through a lot of changes. It is famous for having been Shakespeare's church, which is its nickname. That's what it's called. But when you look at the history of the church, it informs your study of William Shakespeare, and I'm going to give you a few examples. Now, William Shakespeare was baptized here in April of 1564. He was baptized on April 26th, and that is shown in the parish records, which the church still owns, but Shakespeare Birthplace Trust keeps them and has them on display so you can see them. But that's how we know about when William Shakespeare was born, because typically children were baptized about 3 days after they were born. And so we estimate that William Shakespeare was born then on April 23rd. When you walk into Holy Trinity Church, you'll see this big monument of William Shakespeare on the wall, and it's hanging up there like a statue that they've hung on the wall. And this was put there for Shakespeare using proceeds from the play Othello, or so says the article that I read, and I'll link you to that. That's the kind of fact I like to confirm, and I haven't actually confirmed that, but I can confirm that there is actually a statue hanging on the wall dedicated to Shakespeare, because I've stood there and I saw it. So that one's definitely there. How it was paid for, I have one reference that says it was paid for from proceeds from the play Othello being performed in Stratford upon Avon. I will have to look that up and find out if I can find a secondary source to corroborate that. Now, what's interesting when you go in there is you'll see William Shakespeare's grave, and you see his family's grave. Susanna is buried there. Susanna's husband, John Hall, is buried there. And you see his different family members. You've got William Shakespeare, and then his wife Anne, and then John Hall and Susanna. Interestingly, Thomas and Judith Quiney, Judith being Shakespeare's younger daughter, is not buried there. And I don't know the reason why, but I'm going to have to guess it has something to do with the fact that she was rather disgraced. Her husband, Thomas Quiney, was accused of having an affair and fathering an illegitimate child by another lady in the town just a month before William Shakespeare himself died. And some even suggest that the stress of that entire episode contributed to Shakespeare's what is a reasonably early death. There were other Elizabethans that lived a lot longer than the 52 years Shakespeare was on the earth. But that entire scandal could be why Judith wasn't buried there next to her father. Interestingly, we have record that she was buried at Holy Trinity Church, but she was buried in the churchyard, and they don't actually know where her grave is now. William Shakespeare has a famous epitaph written on his grave that says, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust and close it here. Blessed be the man who spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Now, that's a rough translation, but basically Shakespeare was trying to protect his dead body from being exhumed and examined, as well as being moved to Westminster Abbey, which you'll note lots of very famous and well-established poets did get moved to Westminster Abbey after some time interred in their hometown, and Shakespeare didn't want to be. And so that's one reason he put that on his grave. Now, as far as the history of Protestant versus Catholic, which I feel is an interesting opportunity to talk about in terms of Shakespeare's life, when we look at Holy Trinity Church, is that in 1547, Henry VIII died and Edward VI became king. When he became king, he passed a law that said readings of the Bible had to be done in English, and you had to get rid of all of the Catholic practices like processing around the church as well as reciting the rosary were no longer allowed. The Protestants living in the town had a field day with this and thought it was fabulous and loved to get various Catholics in trouble for not obeying the law. By June of the following year, the Guild Chapel, which is also there in Stratford Upon Avon, and you can go there and visit that, was handed back over to Holy Trinity Church. I couldn't find a record on Holy Trinity Church's website as to why the Guild Chapel was removed and then had to be returned, but it was taken away, and it was actually William Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare's job to paint over the Catholic images inside the Guild Chapel. When Elizabeth was reigning, she demanded that the Catholic images be covered up inside the church, and John Shakespeare was in a position to be the one that was responsible for making that happen. Now, when you visit there, they have uncovered the Catholic images and taken off the whitewashing, and you can go and you can actually see them. They were buried there behind the paint, and you can see them inside the Guild Chapel now. Throughout the 1540s and early 1550s, there's numerous records of vicars at Holy Trinity Church basically fighting with the local authorities and with the government over what they're allowed to have and what they're not allowed to have. You can see massive tensions between Catholics and Protestants, and there's some things that are allowed and other things that aren't, and that fluctuates and basically tosses back and forth in it's like a football match essentially between these two sides trying to win out. What is interesting is that Shakespeare did attend this church for his entire life. Every time he was in Stratford Upon Avon, this is where he would go to church, and for the entirety of his life, it was a Protestant church. By the mid-1550s, however, you have Queen Mary on the scene, and she's coming in and basically burning the Protestants by the hundreds. When then it flips back over by 1558, just 8 years later, not even a full decade, Queen Elizabeth is now on the throne. Mary Tudor has died, and Cardinal Pole died just a few hours after Mary Tudor, and Elizabeth I is queen. Within 1 year of becoming queen, she passes what's called the Act of Uniformity, which says that everyone has to use the 1552 prayer book, and everybody has to show up at church on Sundays. You have to be there for church on Sundays, you have to be there for holy days, and you have to be sober-minded and respect the church services. She passes this for everyone, and it basically becomes treasonous to not be Protestant. So anyone who is Catholic then starts getting arrested, and it becomes illegal, and you can be arrested for supporting a Catholic priest. If you're hiding them, aiding, abetting them, you could be sought out and arrested by the government. And this is all going on in Shakespeare's hometown while he's growing up, going to school, heading off to London and becoming a famous playwright. What's interesting about studying William Shakespeare's works is that Shakespeare does quote the Bible in his plays, and for his early plays, he quotes the Cloverdale Bible, which was reissued in 1568, just 4 years after he was born. Shakespeare was 4 years old, and it was reissued as the Bishop's Bible, and that's the one that he quotes the most often in his early plays. But then later, after Mary Queen of Scots was imprisoned in England and became this rallying point for Catholics, Pope Pius V excommunicates Queen Elizabeth I and basically makes it okay to rebel against the Queen. And all this is going on, and William Shakespeare has started school then in the 1570s. And so he's going to school while all of this religious turmoil is happening around him. By 1581 is when it becomes treasonable to be Roman Catholic. Now, this was around the time William Shakespeare was 17 years old. It was literally illegal to be a Roman Catholic. And the very next year, when he was 18 in 1582, he married Anne Hathaway at Temple Grafton. And interestingly, in 1586, there's a report that says the priest who married William Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway is not known for being able to read very well or to be able to preach very well, but he is able to cure hawks that get hurt or diseased. Sounds like a pretty cool guy to me. His name was John Frith, and he was the vicar there at Temple Grafton, and he married William and Anne Shakespeare. One interesting fact about Stratford Upon Avon and Holy Trinity Church specifically is that moving on in the history of William Shakespeare, around the year 1590, they held what's called ecclesiastical court. It was also called the body court or the church court. And basically what it is you could be brought up on official charges for immoral behavior, behavior that violated the religion. You could be charged for in this court. And it was held once a month at Holy Trinity Church. Basically, if you didn't attend church, you didn't follow some of these Act of Uniformity things that Elizabeth had passed, and you could be brought up and charged here. Susanna Shakespeare was actually charged at one of these courts for not taking communion at Easter. Several of Shakespeare's neighbors and friends there in Stratford upon Avon would see themselves brought up on charges of not taking communion. His own father would be brought up on charges of not paying debt. And then, as I mentioned, when Susanna was brought up on charges of not taking communion at Easter, that was done the same year William Shakespeare is staging Macbeth and Antony and Cleopatra. What was interesting about Susanna's charges is that up until this point in time, around the early 1600s, it had been acceptable for church papists to abstain from communion. It was frowned upon, but it wasn't prosecuted. After the gunpowder plot, you would see them taking that much more seriously. It was considered much more suspicious behavior than it had been before that. A very fun fact about William Shakespeare's plays is that a lot of people believe that Malvolio in Twelfth Night is based on a prominent Puritan from Stratford upon Avon, which William Shakespeare would have known, named Daniel Baker. Daniel Baker was a man considered basically to be faking his morality. He was, quote, had a reputation of being a deceitful hypocrite, hiding many different manner of immorality behind a smooth and godly veneer. And that is basically the description of Malvolio from Twelfth Night as well. So a lot of historians think that this man was one William Shakespeare would have known and potentially based this character upon. The history of Holy Trinity Church is a rich one, and it is a wonderful study into the life of William Shakespeare. I encourage you to study more, and I will include learn more links where you can explore and learn and see plenty of pictures from my recent trip there, all in a blog post that is part of today's show notes. You can visit all of these show notes at cassiecash.com/didshakespearechurch. That's did Shakespeare Church, like all one big word. You can spell it out if you like, or there's a nice fancy little link right below this video, and you can just go and click that to see all of the write-up, learn more links, and photos that I have posted for you there. That's it for this week. I'm Cassie Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. Early bird tickets for the Shakespeare 2019 tour went on sale yesterday, but there is still time to grab your almost $400 discount off of the ticket price for that trip. If you are interested in going with us, we will be seeing Holy Trinity Church on that trip next year. And walking around, you'll get to see Shakespeare's grave, as well as several of the parish records I mentioned in today's video. If you would like to travel with us in 2019 and you would like to get the early bird discount, there's a link below for a special email list that you can sign up for. I am only allowed to give the discounted tickets to people on this email list. So if you are interested, please click that and we'll make sure that you get the early bird ticket link and where you can buy that and save your spot at a massive discount. And tell your friends, because the tickets will go on general release later this month in October. They'll be available to anyone everywhere, and that's coming soon. So hopefully I will see you on the trip. It's going to be a great time. Bye-bye.